Sorry, miss, executives only beyond this point. It wasn't the first time Blaire Clark had been mistaken for someone who didn't belong, but tonight it stung differently. Inside, her ex-lover and his new partner, Sloane Vance, the model with $1 million smile, were soaking up applause for a brand she had built from nothing. Her name wasn't on the guest list, her photo wasn't on the wall, but her fingerprints were on every inch of that empire, and the people too blind to see her now were already working for her. Because what they didn't know was that Halcyon Co, their temple of ambition, was under new management. Hers. Stay with us, because what begins as humiliation ends in a takeover. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. Have you ever been replaced, made to feel like you were too much, only to realize later they couldn't handle your power? Because tonight's story isn't just about betrayal. It's about what happens when the woman they dismissed comes back not for revenge but for control, the kind of control that doesn't shout, it signs, it owns, it redefines the game entirely. New York had always been their backdrop, its skyline glittering like a promise, its pace matching the rhythm of their rise. Aaron Robinson and Blaire Clark were the kind of couple who looked inevitable, like two constellations that had always belonged to the same sky. At Halcyon Co, their partnership was legend. Aaron, with his effortless charisma and tailored precision, commanded boardrooms the way some men commanded stages. Blaire, calm and deliberate, had the mind that made luxury look effortless. Every campaign she touched turned into a statement. Every brand under her direction became synonymous with desire. She was the quiet storm behind Halcyon's success, the strategist who could read a market before it shifted, and for years Aaron had admired her for it. They built an empire together, one late night at a time, her sketching taglines across cocktail napkins, him running numbers by the glow of city lights. They had shared ambition, laughter, and the kind of trust that comes from building something out of nothing. But power, like love, has a way of testing the foundations it rests on. Somewhere between the gala invitations and the champagne toasts, Aaron began to crave something simpler, or at least that's what he told himself. Then came Sloane Vance, a model with ice blonde hair, a smile trained for cameras, and a charm that thrived in spotlight. Where Blaire's elegance was deliberate, Sloane's allure was chaotic, designed to be seen. She laughed at Aaron's jokes without understanding them, touched his arm like every word he spoke mattered. And Aaron, whose ego had grown accustomed to sharp minds and sharper critiques, found the ease intoxicating. Blaire's silence, once his refuge, began to feel like judgment. He told her one night, under the dim light of their penthouse kitchen, that he needed something lighter. The words hung between them like smoke. Blaire didn't shout, didn't beg. She simply looked at him, really looked at him, as if memorizing the man she had once believed unshakable. Then she nodded. "Then go find it," she said, her voice steady, her composure unbroken. But when he walked out, briefcase in hand, she felt the ground shift beneath her feet, not from heartbreak, but from realization. Aaron thought he was walking toward freedom. In truth, he was leaving behind the foundation of everything he'd built, because Blaire's intensity, the fire he couldn't handle, was the same force that had made him. And soon, when the world applauded his new life, he'd learn what it meant to rise without the woman who taught him how. The news spread faster than any press campaign Blaire had ever launched. One morning, her face was on every industry site. Not because of a new Halcyon success, but because Aaron Robinson had been photographed in Capri, kissing Sloane Vance beneath a banner that read, "Halcyon celebrates innovation." To the public, it looked like a new chapter for the company's golden boy. To those inside the glass walls of the firm, it looked like a betrayal dressed as rebranding. Blaire walked through those halls the next day as if she hadn't seen a thing. Her stride was steady, her chin high, her silence impenetrable. But behind the calm, something deliberate had begun to take shape. Aaron's new relationship became an open secret, the kind of scandal the industry pretended to admire because it glittered. Clients called to congratulate him. The board smiled through gritted teeth. And Blaire, ever the professional, kept the campaigns running on schedule until the day she decided not to. Her resignation letter was one sentence long, no drama, no explanation. Just a date, a signature, and the kind of finality that comes from knowing one's worth. She handed it to the assistant she'd once mentored and left before Aaron returned from lunch with Sloane. He didn't notice she was gone until her office light failed to turn on that evening. That was how it ended. Not with shouting or tears, but with an empty desk and the faint scent of her jasmine perfume fading into the air. When word reached him, Aaron laughed it off for the cameras. "We're still friends," he told reporters, "just moving in different directions." He didn't see the irony in the phrase. Meanwhile, Blaire stayed invisible. No statements, no interviews. She declined every invitation, every panel, every attempt to make her the story. For the first time in years, she let herself disappear from the world she'd built. But invisibility, she discovered, was its own kind of power. It gave her room to think, to breathe, to plan. She started sketching ideas on napkins again, like she had before Halcyon, before Aaron. Except this time, the brand she was rebuilding wasn't a product or a company. It was herself. Aaron believed he had replaced her with something brighter, something easier to display. But what he didn't understand was that Blaire's silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. She had built empires from ideas smaller than this heartbreak. And while he was posing for cameras, she was drafting the blueprint for the empire that would one day own his. London didn't ask questions. It simply absorbed her. The city's rain-soaked mornings and late-night skyline suited her better than New York's glitter ever had. Blaire moved through it quietly, no longer the woman defined by her proximity to power, but by the precision of her own. At Lucent Holdings, she was the kind of consultant who didn't need to raise her voice to command a room. The executives, older men with too much confidence and too little imagination, learned quickly that when Blaire Clark spoke, profits followed. Her presentations were symphonies of insight and strategy, every slide a weapon disguised as elegance. She traded the glass offices of Halcyon for boardrooms overlooking the Thames, where decisions weren't made for headlines but for empire. Lucent's CEO, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn Harlow, saw in Blaire something rare: clarity without ego. Evelyn offered her not just a contract, but mentorship and access. Together, they dissected markets, predicted shifts, and built a portfolio that turned heads in silence. For Blaire, the work wasn't about redemption. It was about evolution. The heartbreak had become irrelevant. What mattered now was control. Her days were filled with numbers, acquisitions, and quiet power moves. She stopped attending events, stopped reading the gossip blogs that still paired Aaron and Sloane under headlines about love and legacy. When she thought of them at all, it was only to remind herself how small their world had been, how limited by image and vanity. Her world had expanded, and in that expansion she began to see an opportunity. It came during a late meeting, when Evelyn slid a file across the table. "Halcyon and Company," she said simply. The company was faltering under mismanagement and bloated marketing costs. Blaire recognized the figures instantly. Her old projects diluted, her strategies abandoned, Aaron's ambition finally outpacing his competence. The numbers told a story of ego outgrowing structure, of leadership that mistook visibility for vision. She didn't hesitate. "We can rebuild it," Blaire said. What Evelyn didn't know, what no one knew, was how personal this was. Blaire didn't need revenge. What she needed was precision. Her fingerprints began appearing subtly. An investor recommendation here, a restructuring clause there. Every legal document passed through her hands carried the quiet imprint of her intent. By the time Lucent Holdings finalized the acquisition bid, Halcyon Co was already hers in everything but name. The woman they had written off was no longer playing their game. She was redesigning the board, and soon every piece, Aaron included, would move exactly where she wanted. The gala glittered with the kind of excess Halcyon had once built its empire on. Floor-to-ceiling glass, gold-trimmed decor, and a sea of champagne flutes held by people pretending they weren't drowning in debt. Aaron moved through the crowd with his usual confidence, a man who believed every spotlight belonged to him. His arm rested lightly around Sloane's waist, her sequined gown catching every flash of the photographers. But when Blaire stepped into the lobby, the air shifted. Conversations slowed. The music seemed to dim, and for a moment, even the chandelier's light bent toward her. She didn't rush, didn't perform. Her walk was measured, each step deliberate, every eye that turned toward her rewarded with the quiet reminder that presence didn't need to shout to command attention. The black dress she wore fit like intention, simple, sculpted, final. Her curls framed her face in soft defiance, her expression calm yet unreadable. She looked untouched by time, success distilled into flesh and focus. When she reached the check-in desk, she introduced herself to the coordinator in the even tone of someone who belonged. Blaire Clark, consulting for Lucent Holdings. Aaron caught sight of her reflection in the glass wall before he saw her fully. For a heartbeat, he thought it was a trick of memory, but then she turned, and the space between them closed like a memory snapping back into place. His rehearsed smile faltered. She gave him a nod, polite, professional, devastating in its restraint, and moved on. He felt the moment land, sharp and cold, the same way one feels the absence of air. Sloane noticed too. Her hand tightened around his arm, her practiced smile wobbling as she followed his gaze. "Who's that?" she asked, the sweetness of her voice thinning with unease. Aaron forced a shrug, the kind meant to dismiss what couldn't be dismissed. "Consultant," he muttered, but his eyes lingered longer than they should have. Throughout the night, Blaire floated through the event like a quiet storm, gracious in conversation, efficient in observation, invisible only to those foolish enough to overlook her. The executives from Lucent deferred to her subtly, a tilt of the head here, a pause for her opinion there. Aaron saw it, even if no one else did. The respect, the gravity, the influence he'd once mistaken for intensity. By the time the speeches began, he couldn't focus. Every toast, every laugh, every flash of light reminded him of the one truth he'd buried. He hadn't just lost her. He'd lost the part of himself that was great because of her, and she was back now, not as his past, but as the force that would soon own his future. Sloane had built her world from reflections, mirrors, lenses, and screens that told her who she was supposed to be. But now, every glossy surface seemed to betray her. Whenever Blaire appeared at Halcyon, poised and effortless in her restraint, Sloane felt something inside her twist. It wasn't just insecurity, it was recognition. Blaire was everything she was pretending to be, composed, intelligent, magnetic without trying. And no amount of curated perfection could compete with authenticity. The cracks began small. A snapped comment about Blaire's corporate stiffness, a clipped tone when Aaron mentioned her name. At first he brushed it off, amused by Sloane's possessiveness, but amusement soon turned to exhaustion. He caught himself comparing them in quiet moments, how Blaire had once grounded him while Sloane demanded to be entertained, how Blaire's silence had steadied a room while Sloane filled it with noise. Even her beauty, which had once stunned him, began to feel hollow beside Blaire's quiet strength. Their arguments became sharper, timed to the rhythm of headlines. When the tabloids called Blaire Halcyon's mysterious new power player, Sloane threw the magazine across the penthouse. "You still want her?" she accused, her voice rising above the hum of the city outside. Aaron didn't answer. His silence said enough. He didn't want to admit it, not even to himself. But the truth was beginning to haunt him. Every time Blaire spoke at a meeting, her insight cut cleaner than his. Every time she entered a room, the energy bent toward her as naturally as light bends toward truth. Sloane started dressing like her. Sleek blazers, minimalist jewelry, her laughter toned down to something practiced. But imitation only magnified the difference. The executives who once flattered her for her beauty now spoke to her as though she were furniture. They turned instead to Blaire, the woman they couldn't quite categorize but instinctively respected. Sloane's smile began to crack, her presence shrinking under the weight of her own reflection. Aaron noticed, though he wouldn't say it aloud. The woman he'd chosen for simplicity had made his life complicated. The one he'd left for being too much now defined the standard by which everyone measured him. When Blaire crossed his path at the office one afternoon, her tone calm, her words precise, he realized the cruel symmetry of it all. He had traded substance for sparkle, and standing between the two women now, one fading, one ascending, he understood what it meant to be on the wrong side of history. The silence that followed her words was the kind that weighed more than sound. Every executive in the room shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between Aaron and Blaire as the reality sank in. The woman he'd left, the strategist he'd once dismissed as too intense, now stood at the head of his company. Not as a guest, not as a consultant, but as the owner. Blaire didn't need to raise her voice or lean on theatrics. Her authority came from stillness, from the kind of control that doesn't ask for attention because it already has it. Aaron sat frozen, his practiced smile faltering beneath the weight of her gaze. The lucent board members flanked her like quiet armor, their composure a mirror of her own. She began outlining the transition plan, her tone clinical yet warm enough to keep the illusion of diplomacy intact. Departments would merge, marketing would streamline, and leadership roles would be evaluated for long-term alignment. It was the kind of corporate language Aaron had once used to disguise firings. Now it was being used on him. As she spoke, he caught details in her delivery that made his pulse quicken, phrases she'd once used in Halcyon meetings, her cadence steady, deliberate, familiar. She hadn't changed her playbook. She'd simply learned how to play it at a higher level. Every sentence was precise, every pause intentional. When her eyes met his again, there was no malice, just clarity. The kind that comes from knowing you've already won. Sloane sat a few rows behind him, sunglasses perched on her head like armor, scrolling through her phone in restless frustration. She had come expecting another event to elevate their status. Instead, she found herself in the audience of Aaron's undoing. When Blaire mentioned structural realignment, Sloane's brow furrowed. Aaron didn't move. His throat was dry, his pulse sharp. He couldn't even look at her directly. The room, the lights, the murmurs, all of it seemed to blur around the single truth standing before him. When Blaire concluded, she offered the room a smile, polished, diplomatic, final. Halcyon's legacy deserves stewardship that matches its potential, she said softly, and I intend to honor that. The applause that followed was hesitant, uncertain, the sound of compliance, not celebration. Aaron's palms felt cold against the polished oak table as she stepped closer, extending a hand for a professional greeting. "Welcome to the new Halcyon," Blaire said, her voice smooth, unshaken. "I trust we'll make this transition seamless." He took her hand, his own trembling ever so slightly. It was the first time in his life that power didn't feel like victory. It felt like consequence. Aaron had spent years mastering the art of control, his charm, his composure, the effortless way he could spin failure into finesse. But Blaire dismantled all of it with precision, one spreadsheet at a time. The first meeting after the acquisition was supposed to be routine, an update for the new leadership. Instead, it became an autopsy of his decisions. She didn't raise her voice or humiliate him publicly. She simply asked questions, each one cutting deeper than accusation. Why was this campaign approved without ROI analysis? Who authorized this budget increase? What's the projected return on a model partnership that's already over budget? Her tone was neutral, her phrasing surgical. But by the end of the hour, everyone in the room understood who had really been running Halcyon, and who had been running it into the ground. He tried to meet her calm with confidence, but the old tricks fell flat. The board no longer looked to him for answers. They looked to her. She didn't gloat or lean into the power shift. She simply filled the silence he left behind. When she turned to the screen and pulled up his latest quarterly summary, the numbers told a story even he couldn't charm away. Overspending, declining engagement, personal expenses disguised as corporate initiatives. He saw his reflection in the polished table and almost didn't recognize the man staring back. Sloane's campaign photos glared from the slides, her face splashed across luxury ads that had bled millions with no measurable return. The board murmured quietly. Aaron cleared his throat, muttering about brand alignment and market positioning, but Blaire cut in softly. "You built this company on perception," she said, her gaze steady. "I'm here to build it on purpose." The line landed like a verdict. No anger, no triumph, just truth. Afterward, she dismissed the room with the same grace she'd once reserved for him. "Thank you, everyone. That will be all." Chairs scraped, papers shuffled. No one met his eyes as they filed out. When the door finally shut, silence stretched between them. Aaron's mask slipped. "Blaire, I never meant to." She lifted a hand. "Don't explain," she said quietly. "You made choices. So did I." For the first time, he saw what he had created, not just in her but in himself. He'd traded partnership for pride, love for leverage, and ended up alone at a table she now owned. She gathered her papers, offered him a polite nod, and left him there, surrounded by everything he'd built and everything she now controlled. The headlines came first, sharp, merciless, and relentless. Model muse no more. Sloane Vance dropped from major campaigns. Halcyon's golden couple falls from grace. The very photographers who once begged for her angles now sold her exhaustion to the tabloids. She tried to fight it at first, called her agent, blamed her manager, insisted it was temporary. But fame is a tide that never turns back. Her face disappeared from billboards. Invitations stopped arriving. The world that had once applauded her beauty now turned away, hungry for someone new. Aaron watched the unraveling from a distance he hadn't chosen. His phone, once filled with meetings and messages, now stayed still on his desk. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was punishing. He had spent years chasing attention, believing it was the same as admiration. Now, with no one left to impress, he saw how hollow it had always been. The investors who'd once courted him no longer returned his calls. Friends, those who had smiled through champagne toasts, had evaporated overnight. Reputation, he learned, was a currency that didn't survive inflation. Blaire, meanwhile, moved through the chaos untouched. Her leadership stabilized Halcyon in record time, restoring the brand's credibility and transforming it into something stronger, smarter, more ethical. The press praised her innovation, calling her the woman who turned scandal into strategy. She accepted interviews sparingly, always composed, never boastful. When asked about Aaron or the company's previous missteps, she offered a single line: "We're focused on the future." The restraint only made her more respected. Sloane reached out once, a trembling message sent late one night. "He's different now." Lost. You won. Blaire never replied. There was nothing to win. The game had ended long ago. Aaron, for all his regret, had become a spectator in the empire he'd once ruled. He saw her photo in business journals, her posture steady, her expression serene. She wasn't the woman he'd left. She was the woman he'd never really seen. One afternoon, he passed Halcyon's headquarters and stopped across the street. Through the glass, he saw her, Blaire in a meeting, poised and confident, surrounded by people who listened when she spoke. He realized then that she had never needed his validation. She had only ever needed space to rise. He turned away before she could see him, the reflection of her world shimmering behind him like a reminder of everything he had mistaken for love and everything she had become without him. The morning light spilled across her desk, gilding the edges of the reports she no longer had to prove herself through. Blaire leaned against the window, the skyline sprawling before her like a map of everything she had survived. New York pulsed below, impatient, glittering, alive, but she stood apart from it now, steady and unhurried. The empire she had rebuilt thrived without spectacle. Halcyon's numbers were stronger than ever, its reputation restored, its culture transformed. She had kept her promise, to lead with purpose, not perception, and the world had noticed. When her assistant entered with the morning papers, Blaire didn't need to look to know her name was there. She saw it in the reflection of every building that mirrored her office. The woman who reclaimed an empire. Grace in the face of betrayal. How Blaire Clark redefined power. She didn't chase the headlines, but they came anyway. Not because she sought attention, but because she represented something rare in a world built on noise, quiet resilience. There were still reminders of her past. An old email from Aaron's address, never opened. A news piece about Sloane's latest attempt at reinvention. But those things no longer carried weight. They were echoes, distant and dull. What once hurt now only reminded her of how far she'd risen. Her revenge hadn't been public or cruel. It had been measured, complete, and dignified. Freedom was her trophy, not victory. That afternoon, she hosted her first leadership summit since taking full control. The room was filled with diverse voices, designers, analysts, interns, people who had once felt invisible in Halcyon's old world. Power, she told them, her tone soft but unwavering, means nothing if it doesn't make room for others to rise. The applause that followed wasn't for her triumph. It was for the truth she carried into every decision. When the day ended, she stayed a moment longer, watching the city lights come alive one by one. Somewhere down there, she imagined, Aaron might be looking up at the same skyline. She didn't wish him harm. She wished him understanding, the kind that only arrives after the fall. As the evening settled over Manhattan, Blaire turned away from the window and gathered her things. She didn't need to stay late anymore. Her work was no longer about proving she belonged. It was about building something that would outlast her. And in that quiet, she finally understood what true power sounded like. Silence that didn't demand to be heard, because it had already been felt. If this story moved you, share it. Someone out there has been left for something shinier, forgotten, underestimated, erased, and needs to be reminded that real power doesn't chase attention. It builds empires in silence. Comment below if you've ever been replaced, only to come back stronger, calmer, and in charge of everything they thought they took from you. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, drop a comment, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more stories that uncover hidden struggles, celebrate strength, and remind us that every voice matters.